ecological, the climate crisis, the biodiversity loss that we're now witnessing. And yet we're continuing in business as usual manner ourselves in terms of our teaching, our research, our outreach and engagement. So I'm very much looking forward to what Jenny has to say. Jenny is a climate justice scholar and activist, so Éireann Ciróg Ella. For those who don't speak Gaelic, that means it takes one to know one. So I see a kindred spirit in Jenny. And her last book, and she'll probably tell us about the new book she's working on, but her last book was Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on the Climate and Energy. She's Dean's Professor of Sustainability, Science and Policy at Northeastern. And today she's going to be talking to us on reimagining universities as change agents for climate and economic justice. So can I ask you all online and in person to give Jenny a virtual and warm Belfast welcome.
Great to be here, and thank you all for being here on this beautiful day where sun is shining, and really great to be here and talking about this topic. What I found is this is a topic that kind of connects with everyone in different ways, because I think one of the premises of my work, and one of the things that I've kind of been increasingly considering, is that in a way higher education is an untapped resource for society to address the challenges that we're experiencing. And so I'm on sabbatical this year here in Ireland and also in London. And I have been exploring, having some distance from my own university has also allowed me to explore this topic in a more kind of broader way than I have when I'm in the midst of all my university responsibilities. So I want to just begin by saying a couple of things. First of all, I don't have an answer on what should be done, or my ideas, I think, are quite provocative about what could be different. And so I really offer this as a conversation starter, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts and reactions and what resonates, what doesn't, because it's really a very dynamic time in the world and in our universities. So it's great to have a chance to discuss. And I will say, what I'm offering here is really a paradigm shift. So it's quite a different kind of vision of really trying to reimagine what's possible. And so because of that, it's actually quite critical and self-reflective. And also, sometimes it might make some people uncomfortable because it's so different than what we're used to. So, but we know that that's how, change happens, is you have to kind of get out of your comfort zone. So I just mentioned that one of the paradox of higher education institutions is that we're designed to teach, but not necessarily teach themselves, right? In terms of organizational or institutional learning. So kind of starting with that kind of premise. So I also just want to put forth that, any disagreements in anything, actually, in politics and in thinking about the world, are often about what we think cannot change and what we believe is possible to change, right? And so we're all making judgments all the time about the world, and this is never going to change, so therefore we're going to try this or do that. But if you believe that something really can change, you can open up your mind to other possibilities. So what I hope to do in the time we have is to really kind of expand what we think about the university and what is possible. So it's really a reimagining, and it takes a shift in how we're thinking about the role of universities in society. So to begin, I'll just quickly introduce myself, my background, so you know who I am and where I'm coming from. I was actually born in Dublin, here in Ireland, and my family moved to Boston when I was 8 years old. And so I have dual citizenship. I was always interested in environment and science and policy interface. I got my graduate work in California in very technical environmental science and engineering, then came back to Boston, did work on kind of energy innovation, worked at a university called Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is about an hour outside Boston. I was there for 9 years. Then I worked at University of Vermont, which is north of Bernie Sanders land, north of Boston. And then I've been at Northeastern University for the past 6-7 years. And then I've been here this year in Ireland, and next year I actually have a fellowship at Harvard, a climate justice fellowship. So I will be back in the Boston area, and also returning to Northeastern. So that gives you just a spectrum. I've spent my whole career pretty much in academia, not necessarily what I expected. I didn't grow up and say I want to be a professor. I thought I would be more an environmental policymaker, advocate. But you know, things happen, and you never know exactly how you get where you're going, but it happens. So what I want to propose, and one potential title of my forthcoming book is called Climate Justice University. And it's about using the climate crisis and the inequities that the climate crisis is revealing and worsening to really question the role of the university. And what I found is a helpful way to think about this is universities are knowledge-based organizations, right, in society. But and their knowledge is integrally linked to both power and wealth. We don't always think of universities and how they contribute to the concentration of wealth and power. But I want to propose that we have to be constantly thinking about these issues and the relationships, because it's very complicated. And there's lots of different mechanisms for the knowledge to be used as power, knowledge to be used for profit seeking and accumulation of wealth, and also to marginalize people through knowledge and power and wealth. So there's this very complex way of thinking here, and I just think I found that it's helpful to put that right up front, so that then we can come back to that framework and kind of accept that. And obviously it's not, there's no one way here. There's lots of different things. And it's not to break these connections. It's kind of accepting that there are linkages among these three things, and universities play a big role. So obviously, conventionally, we think about universities as contributing in the knowledge space, right? We teach, we disseminate knowledge, and we do research, which is, generating new knowledge is sometimes the way research is described in terms of an activity. But we also are increasingly, universities are financialized organizations, and we're part of this financialization of society. So we're also contributing to wealth patterns and dynamics and this accumulation of wealth. And then we also have a lot of power with our engagement outside the university, with different political agendas, with corporate interests, and with the communities that we're affiliated with. So there's a lot of different ways to think about the role of the university in society. I want to acknowledge that a lot of these ideas, some of these ideas have evolved from work I've done with 6 students at Northeastern, a group of both graduate students and undergraduate students. And we published a paper a few months ago that is open access. So if anyone's interested, you can help go and take a look. That really is thinking about climate justice in higher education and proposing a paradigm shift for a more transformative role of universities. So I want to begin by kind of acknowledging that that when I talk about the Climate Justice University, it's not because I think climate is the be-all end-all issue that needs to be addressed, and that is a lens that some climate activists kind of have taken, which sometimes ends up being not a good strategy, and it actually contributes to what I call climate isolationism, is thinking about climate without thinking about everything else. So I'm not advocating for that, but the reason I talk about climate justice in the university as like an anchoring idea is because climate change is, one of the most horrible symptoms of the economic systems that we have. And, where we are right now, really in this time of poly crisis, slow violence, and this concentration of wealth and power that's just getting worse. And so basically, we're going in the wrong direction on so many levels. That I propose that focusing on climate justice is a helpful frame that connects all of these different things that are going on. And so I want to be very clear about this point that mainstream climate action is different than what I'm talking about when I talk about climate justice. So mainstream climate action is often focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonizing the energy system or the economy. The approach mainstream is to focus on market mechanisms, technological innovation, and individual behavior change. And this is what I call climate isolationism, right? It's thinking that we have to fix or solve the climate crisis, so we need to do these things, and we can use the systems that we have to do it. And it's a very narrow, linear, kind of technocratic way of thinking about the problem. And we know, we've been trying this for decades now, and things are getting worse. We're not actually making effective change. The fossil fuel companies have no plans to stop exploring and extracting fossil fuels. So we're actually, in a pretty, this hasn't worked, I guess. It's pretty clear. So what I propose, and what many in the climate justice space are proposing, is a very different way of thinking about the climate crisis. And what we need is to focus on climate justice, which means the goal would be to reduce human vulnerabilities, marginalization, exploitation, and oppression by enhancing equity and justice. So really focusing on distribution, ill issues, and health and well-being of people around the world, and which is very different, right, than focusing on greenhouse gas emissions. And the approach involves investing in people and communities, understanding and resisting the structures, policies, practices, and relationships that maintain those injustices, and really thinking about solidarity and collective action. And I mentioned that this is really based on feminist scholarship, and I mentioned feminist scholarship in particular because the patriarchal structures that are continued to be perpetuated, we are among the structures that are most obvious to most people. But really, feminist scholarship means paying attention to power dynamics and the structural and systemic issues that continue to marginalize some while privileging others. And this is just central to the whole idea of climate justice. In my 2020 book, Diversifying Power, talked a lot about this feminist perspective and why it's so important in how we address climate change. And climate justice is really emerging as an urgent global policy priority, focusing on social, economic, and institutional change. And it attempts to redress the legacy of coloniality and economic injustice and extractivism and exploitation. And it really prioritizes transformation. So that transformational piece is really important, and recognizes the need for disruption of the status quo financial systems. So I'm embracing a transformative lens that I bring when we talk about the university. Like, if we acknowledge we need big transformation, what we then will think about our university is a very different way, right? Because right now, a lot of things that happen in the university are actually reinforcing the status quo, and they're not at all transformative. So then there's this false binary of resisting or reinforcing, right? You can think of all of us individually, our communities, our institutions we work for, and especially when you think about a university, we could be either reinforcing the status quo or we could be resisting. And what I want to suggest is that we're all doing both. We have opportunities to be doing both all the time. It's not one or the other, like resistance, because we're all part of the systems that we're trying to change. Some of our activity and our initiatives and the way we live are in fact reinforcing. So there's no absolute here, I guess. And so I want to put that forward, especially when you think about universities. It's a big, dynamic, bureaucratic organizations with lots of different people, right? Some may be very actively resisting within a university, but that doesn't mean the whole university is. And but what I'm interested in, and I want to acknowledge all of the very amazing climate justice work that is going on in universities. But what I'm talking about is moving the whole organizational, institutional structure in a different direction in support of climate justice principles. So there's a whole field on critical university studies that is a growing field. And you can think about how are universities currently reinforcing climate injustice? And this is not a comprehensive list, but there's all kinds of ways that universities in their current structure and form are contributing and reinforcing climate injustice, including concentrating wealth and power, prioritizing technical innovation and technical fixes over social, reinforcing patriarchal colonial ideas and practices, investing and relying on fossil fuels, greenwashing, promoting narrow ways of thinking in disciplines, restricting access in hierarchical training and kind of academic gatekeeping, contributing to loneliness and this individualistic way of living, serving elites who are less worried about issues of justice, catering and responding to corporate interests and philanthropy, and reinforcing this kind of financialization of society. So that's kind of, just a laundry list kind of all some of the ways that universities are contributing to climate injustice. I'm sure there's many more that we could go here, but what I want to do is spend more time not critiquing universities, but thinking, do the reimagining work, like accept this, and then move to, okay, so if that's the case, what can we do differently? I want to propose kind of focus on 4 areas. I talked about teaching, learning, and community and finance, but what I want to propose is in terms of the knowledge space, I think universities could be focusing on unlearning as well as learning. And this is kind of a play of words and a new different way of thinking. But I'll make the case for why unlearning is actually important if we want real transformation. Similarly, in addition to innovation, universities love innovation, right? We focus a lot on innovation. I think we need exnovation, which is intentional consideration for the policies, structures, systems, technologies that are not serving us anymore, right? We need to pay attention and figure out how to exnovate. For example, fossil fuels phase out, right? And then in terms of finance, instead of concentrating wealth, what could universities do to actually be reparative in terms of financial and distributive and thinking differently about the financial structure? And then how can universities kind of do more in terms of local empowerment with global solidarity for the struggles going on locally and globally? So these are kind of the 4 big areas that I want to talk through. And I'll try to do it in a way that leaves plenty of time for discussion. So I won't go into, some things I might brush over, and so we have time for discussion, and because I don't want to go into everything that's possible to discuss in all of this. So, okay, so first I want to talk about this idea of unlearning. And the idea here is that when, it kind of acknowledges the power of learning, right? And once we've learned something, it's actually hard for us to think differently. And what the idea that the fundamental idea here is that if we acknowledge we need big societal transformation, we do actually need to pay attention and figure out what are some things that we need to be unlearning, like not prioritizing in the same way that we have. And it's hard to unlearn. And obviously it's a little bit, in the context of universities, it's a little counterintuitive, right? Because we think of ourselves as learning organizations. So what I want to suggest is that we can do unlearning in multiple ways in terms of the curriculum itself, what we're actually teaching in our universities, how we teach, the pedagogy, and then the epistemological hierarchies that we have been promoting in universities. Universities are very, because of the long legacy of where they've come from, mostly kind of European ideas, and they systematically kind of erase and dismiss and disrespect other ways of knowing and knowledge systems. So there's all kinds of possibilities here for exploring unlearning, and I just want to go into a little bit of detail about a couple. First is economics, and the way economics is taught in universities around the world is in a way that does not teach students about connect economics and the ideas of economics and with a regenerative kind of planetary boundary system in terms of the Earth. And so there's all kinds of pluralism in economics, and that is not usually taught in most university courses in mainstream economics, including ecological economics, donut economics, feminist economics, the whole idea of degrowth. And there are lots of different ways that people are now acknowledging that mainstream economics is actually deceptive in terms of it's a very limited frame and model of how representing what's happening in the real world outside the model, but it's not jiving with what's in reality what we see, right? And we're seeing this more and more right now, and it's becoming more widely accepted that market-based economics is constrained. Like it clearly is not allowing us to prioritize the societal goals that many of us have. So that's one whole area where there's a lot of potential for unlearning. Next, I want to just introduce and explore a little bit this idea of ex-innovation, which can be seen as kind of the antithesis or complementary of innovation. So if you think about innovation as phasing in, creating and acquiring new novel ideas and technologies, ex-innovation is the opposite. It's like phasing out and dismantling and eliminating. And what we're seeing is that the focus on innovation is so dominant, right? We always want new things, and that the economic system obviously promotes this because there's opportunity to make money if we come up with new ideas and new technologies. But we haven't paid invested enough attention to the ex-innovation, right? Like, what are the systems and technologies and things that we actually know that we want to reduce and phase out, but how can we do that? So there's all kinds of things that we could be doing ex-innovative engaged research on. Fossil fuel phase out is top of the list. Plastic-free future, moving away from market-based economics. Like how can we shift our economic system and financialization? Climate obstruction and misinformation. There's been a lot of, I'm involved in quite a bit of work trying to reveal climate obstruction and the interests that have been in promoting certain kinds of ideas and priorities. And so we actually need more research to understand what's been going on in our climate information and obstruction space so that we can reduce that. And then obviously ex-innovation, as I said, is complementary to innovation, right? They're not opposing, they're very complementary. In terms of innovation in social research, we spend a lot of look at research dollars spent around the world, a lot of it is on technological innovation, not as much on social innovation. So we need all kinds of social innovation on cooperative model of organization and businesses, regenerative agriculture, participatory democracy, co-designing, co-producing knowledge, and then reparations and reparative justice. Like, if we acknowledge that the current systems and legacy systems have caused so much harm to so many people, how can we move forward in not just making sure that harm isn't continued, but actually repairing some of that. So I've done a lot of work in my own career on energy, renewable energy, innovations, and what I've come to appreciate throughout the work that I've done is that we have not been focusing on fossil fuel exnovation. And it's literally the biggest challenge facing the world when you think about climate, is how do we keep the fossil fuels in the ground? But there's no university program that I know of on that. It's been an intellectual no-fly zone, really, in academic research. And the reason is simply that corporate interests of fossil fuels have had such a deep influence, not just on the direct research funding calls that are put out from our governments and from foundations, but in kind of an incipient like influence in our bureaucracies within the universities. And there's kind of a hush globally to not talk about fossil fuels, including in the international climate negotiations, which were only mentioned in Glasgow, right, 2 years ago. No, less than 2 years ago. The first time fossil fuels were mentioned after decades of climate negotiations. So, I mean, in terms of official document, obviously there were activists trying to push for this, but it hasn't made its way. So I think exnovation on fossil fuels is a big one. We need a lot of work on that. If anyone needs a project. But then also we need more research on revealing and empowering people to understand how these big, powerful interests have been manipulating and deceiving and orienting the way we're thinking, as well as what we're researching and what we're teaching. And there's quite a lot of being exposed right now because of academic research and other activist research on the funding that fossil fuel industry has and their influence in academia. There's, this was a paper just published a few days ago on reparations, like thinking about climate harm and different countries. This again, just an example of this exnovation research that we could be doing more of, where you actually like map out how emissions from some countries have caused harms in other countries, and if we were trying to distribute, what would it look like in terms of compensation? I have a funded research project with collaborators in power in Puerto Rico, where again, I give this as an example. It's exnovation research because what we're really interested in is understanding is the power of fossil fuel interests in Puerto Rico after the devastation of Hurricane Maria. It was a prime window of opportunity for a renewable transformation to happen, and it really hasn't happened. And so we're studying kind of how and why the fossil gas infrastructure is still being invested and promoted, and why the renewables have been so hard to be embedded. Another example of this kind of research is I'm co-authoring a chapter on climate obstruction in Ireland, about kind of revealing who are the actors in the Irish context who are resisting climate action. And it's a unique case of delay and destruction because of that very first kind of priorities, and then the way the opposition to climate action has leveraged agricultural interests. And so there's some, this should be coming out open access by the end of the year, if you're interested in that. So what I want to do now is shift away from the knowledge. So the unlearning and exnovation kind of focus on the knowledge domain, and talk a little bit about the wealth area. And specifically, some of the ideas when we think about how could universities not be contributing to concentration of wealth, which is connected to power. Just some ideas are more public ownership. I know different countries, the different models for universities. I've been in my career in the United States involved part of many private universities, right, that actually don't have any public. Obviously, there's some public funding for research that is given that they can apply for, but they're really privately owned and privately managed entities. So I think more public ownership, cooperative model, like different modes of thinking about organizational structures. So many universities are increasingly more and more like corporate structure. So just as we see in the corporate world, you know, what that does in terms of limiting what the organization focuses on. You could make a similar argument in terms of more cooperative model, and that could include more faculty governance, for example, and actually having more, I mean, obviously, most universities do have some student and faculty governance systems, but often they're I think they become marginalized over time and actually have less power and influence. Debt-free access for all. I mean, that the cost of higher education continues to go up, which obviously has a big impact on who's able to participate and who has access. And investing in community resilience is another whole way. Like if universities, rather than funding, recruiting and trying to solicit money to reinvest in the university, which is what a lot of universities do, how could universities structure themselves to actually have a stake in and contribute to communities? And one example here I'll just mention is in my own university, there's a giving day every day in April, where the university asks everybody, not just students or alumni, for donations. They ask the faculty and staff also to contribute. And it's quite a big campaign, and it's like, we're all in, we're all contributing, we all should be giving, toward our university. And it's very, I find it very kind of insular, right? Like, and why would faculty and staff, and, I personally, for myself, when I think of all the ways that I could contribute any financial resources to causes, contributing to a wealthy private university doesn't seem like the most effective. But anyway, it's a cultural thing that is happening in universities increasingly. I mentioned here Harvard University recently did a self-reflective report on themselves of what are the connections with Harvard University and slavery. And they revealed that, a lot of the wealth of Harvard University and the prestige and power that comes with all of that is based on wealth from and direct benefit from slave trade and from slave based agriculture and economy in the United States. And there were slaves serving actually students, faculty, and administrators in the early days of Harvard. So they, with the report, they decided to reveal this legacy. And then they also created a fund, it's $100 million endowment fund for slavery reparations. The interesting thing, one interesting thing about that number, 100 million, sounds like a lot in some ways, but when you think about Harvard's total endowment, and you think about just a few months ago, they got one alumni donor gave them 300 million. And again, you kind of wonder, like, if you had 300 million, why would you give it to a university that already has so much money? You know what I mean? Like it's almost, but it's a prestige thing, right? For these billionaires who to get their name on something at Harvard. And the president of Harvard has said, generosity and loyalty are among the defining characteristics of our alumni. In his email to alumni explaining and announcing this big gift. And one of the things that I would like us to explore is, like, what if our universities were able to target or encourage or generate a culture where that generosity goes toward, organizations or communities or people who really need 300 million rather than back to themselves. It's just very reinforcing here. So this whole idea of, could there be a cooperative university? What would that look like? And then there are models. I've been spending time this year at Trinity College Dublin, And I've learned that the university is actually owned by the fellows who are faculty. So on paper, there is some cooperative model, and I think that's not, there are others. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the faculty are that involved in the governance of the institution, but I think there's opportunities to reimagine what could be if it was a more decentralized management of specific universities. And the last kind of category that I want to talk about, besides the unlearning, the ex-novation, and the financial reparations, is power, and just kind of acknowledging, like, we don't necessarily in a lot of our courses or research necessarily study power and power dynamics, and so therefore we're all, I mean, many students graduate without really thinking about how they themselves exert power, how they can be empowered. So there's like all kinds of opportunities for addressing issues of power in every major and curriculum, but also in terms of the university itself, with how it interacts with communities, and co-designing programs, research initiatives with diverse communities. There's all kinds of opportunities at universities to be more intentional about civic education and how to empower students and faculty and staff to build capacity for deliberative democracy, and kind of coordinate and catalyze collective action, right? Getting back to this idea that if universities are kind of these convening spaces that have huge potential for engaging on all kinds of issues and contributing, but we're constrained kind of by some norms and ways of thinking about it. So I just mentioned here 2 organizations. Drift for Transition is a Dutch research institute for transitions, where I just was actually earlier this week visiting, and they are doing some really innovative work in terms of focusing all of their research in community, right? Like co-designing and thinking about how academic research can support social change. And Ecoversities is an alliance, of network of organizations that many of them are not what you might conventionally think of as a university, but they're engaged in community and education and research, and they're forming a kind of a network of globally of alternative structures for engaged empowerment through education. Vandana Shiva has talked about this idea of grandmothers universities. Like, we should have every community should have grandmothers universities, because there's so much knowledge. The idea here is that there's knowledge and that doesn't get passed on because it's not included in our university structure. We need to leverage and institutionalize a way to pass on knowledge of people who haven't had access to our university structures. So there's a Brazilian idea, phrase about that we can't learn to swim until the water is at least at our hips, right? But other people are already swimming, right? Vanessa de Oliveira has spoken about this phrase to kind of acknowledge that we're going into uncharted territory in terms of what's happening in the world, and many people are already really struggling, suffering, and dying. And every day there's more in the news about another big climate disruption. Right now, the United States has air quality worse than ever. So all the legislation for air quality throughout the 70s and 80s that has improved air quality, all of a sudden with some wildfires from Canada is changing back to really dangerous, unhealthy air quality. And obviously there are communities around the world that are struggling in so many different ways. And I think this idea that, you know, we can't necessarily, prepare, like, as the phrase, like, learning to swim before it's deep enough. But we can, be in solidarity and, try to prepare and think ahead and, engage with, what's coming and contribute to those, that are already, struggling. So, so I think that this kind of is a good place to open it up to discussion. I just want to acknowledge, in Boston, where I'm based, there's more universities per, you know, density wise than anywhere else in the world. There's so many different universities there, so many students. And so, a PhD student and I, Elena, we wrote an op-ed in the Boston Globe that started by saying, if universities were contributing to social justice, you would think Boston would be like the held up as a utopian, you know, society, where it's not at all. It's among the most racially and economically, inequitable, cities in the US. And, the universities are, getting a lot of benefits from the city and are actually in many ways kind of extractive, and many communities have been, you know, have had to move because of gentrification, and they're not involved and engaged. And so there's a lot, to learn, I think, from the Boston example. And it's a good way to kind of think about what is, you know, reimagine what the role of universities could be, in society. There's a really good paper by a Trinity College, psychologist, that just was published about thinking about taking the donut economics frame and applying it to academia, the academic donut, and, you know, also kind of promoting this kind of slow academia, you know, like we need to slow down internally and not be on the, financialized treadmill that many of us feel like we are, and the pressure and the, if you're interested, I highly recommend this, paper. And there's so many growing networks globally, of academics who are looking for and engaging with, more transformative, initiatives of all kinds, related to a different future in climate justice. So, this slide actually is from an earlier kind of framing, but I just wanted to because of my work on energy democracy, I've thought about this frame of resist, reclaim, and then restructure organizations, so I think if you think about that resist, reclaim, restructure framework, we need to, in our higher education, resist the corporatization and financialization, reclaim universities as leverage points for social justice and systemic change, through our pedagogy and our, you know, commitment to public good. And then we can really restructure, in our imagining the university as places to expose, to invest in social innovation and exnovation, and kind of prepare, differently. So, two slides here. You may have heard this phrase, changing a university is like moving a graveyard. You don't get much help from inside, but just speaks to, you know, how hard it is, because we're embedded within, and it's not easy. And some of our supervisors don't want us to be asking these kinds of questions. But also, I think I like this, picture of a football pitch, I guess. Just saying that if the landscape changes and you don't change the rules of the game, like it doesn't actually, you can't play, right? Like it's not even effective if you try to play, a game on that pitch. So, the idea just being like, we need to be changing how we're assuming things and how we're doing things. And, so anyway, those are some ideas, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions. Thank you.
That's wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. I have a truckload of questions, but I'm not going to ask. I'm going to offer people here in person or those online. So, Tracy, you just let me know if there are any questions. So, folks online, you just put your question into the chat, and then we'll read it out. But I'll give first offer to people here in the room. Yes, at the back.
Yeah.
And if you could speak up loud because we're trying to pick it up on the mic here.
What I understand from what you're saying has an extrinsic value. What I would suggest is that universities need to establish an intrinsic value first. So I would suggest that Professor Barry, other people set up a think tank. So in the university, collectively working with other departments in the university to define, to work on climate change would be one issue, green economy would be the second issue, and climate justice would be the third issue. Once you've done that and you prepare papers, they can meet, at the end of every month, prepare a paper, then you need to educate and inform your students about what you as their teachers see as the most important issues. And then I would suggest you do what you wish to do, which is to take that to an extrinsic level, which is to bring it out further into community and to society and to broaden it out. But until you do, I think it's important from my understanding and from my opinion to do one and then two. Whereas I would say that you're trying to do the extrinsic without doing the intrinsic.
Okay. Yeah, well, should I respond or?
Yeah, go for that.
Yeah. So thank you. And I appreciate that point. And I think a lot of us have done and continue to do the internal work. I don't know the situation exactly what's happening here, but I know you're busy doing some of this. I think in many universities there is, almost all universities have a sustainability initiative. They have some courses. And they know, everybody knows this is a more and more important issue. So I think there's a lot in many universities have begun that internal work. And I think there's so much more, right? And which is to your points. And I think there is, what I'm suggesting here also is that there's value to expand, to enable expansion of the internal existing work and more of that work to have a bigger impact, that there's opportunity for the larger university institutional infrastructure to embrace some of these ideas as well. Not just in one department or in, so yes, both. And there's so many scales to look at this. Thank you.
If I could quickly respond to that, because you're talking about here, it's like that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I mean, that's what we need to do on this issue.
Yeah.
And wherever model works in particular places, go for it. My only concern about that stepwise, that we need to get ourselves organized within the academy and then go outside, is that by that stage the agenda is kind of set. Whereas if we keep the boundary very loose and porous, it's about how the community itself can help shape our agenda. That's part of the problem. And particularly here in the north of Ireland, I mean, we're coming down with consultation-itis. Whether it's the university, the government is giving out, consult on this particular issue. We know it's already been set. And then what we need is participation, co-creation. But I do think you're right in a way that we do in the academy need to have a good look at ourselves and to do some internal learning as organizations. But I do think we need to get beyond the sense that we as experts know what needs to be done. We have knowledge to give to our communities that should be at their disposal. So I'm more interested in that co-creation, and it's messy in a way, and it'll be different in different places. But I mean, that's what these events are kind of about, bringing in, because many people in the audience here today, and maybe some online, are not staff or students, they're members of the community involved in various initiatives. So I do think that's something that I'll just finish by saying we had a SECA, Centre for Sustainability management meeting today, and that will certainly be something for our next year's events. How do we begin to get that conversation going? But I'm going to invite people to speak, maybe some online as well. But I should have said, could you just say who you are, if you're a member of staff or the community, so that Jenny has a sense of who's in the room. So yourself.
Thank you. My name is Greg, and the reason I threw my hand up so quick, I'm a student here at the university, the reason I threw my hand up so quickly after the gentleman's point was actually to say what John said. I feel like I understand the need to set your table so that you can move out into the world, but if you set the table with the tools and the knowledge that you have internally, then it's an internal agenda, and you're trying to impose that in the outside world, which I feel is kind of what the problem is in the first place. And if you want to kind of deconcentrate that power and that knowledge that you're talking about, I think it's important to engage with not only sort of outside members within the community, but also outside of the kind of like to go a little bit further. It's like outside kind of Western global northern universities. And I was going to ask you, is there in this sort of this decentralization that you're talking about, do you see opportunity to engage with educational communities in the global south, for example, universities or otherwise, to kind of co-create these solutions? Because I feel like if the goal here is to kind of adapt educational institutions to the climate crisis, it can't be a technocratic organized solution imposed on everybody else. It needs to be, as John said, like kind of co-created, and that can only be done through co-consultation with people outside of this little like Western academic system that we have. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that's a big part of it, is opening up to what is it that we're actually lacking in our universities. And a lot of it is this relational education. Like we've disconnected ourselves in a lot of higher education institutions from the land and like natural, I don't like to use the word natural, but non-human systems, I guess, right? And then we've also disconnected ourselves from people in other parts of the world, in other parts of the cities or communities that we are embedded in. So I think this opening up is about acknowledging kind of how our epistemic hierarchy of what knowledge gets taught in universities, what knowledge does not get taught.
What it is.
And then being open to learn, like everybody in the world has knowledge that is valuable, right? That offers insights on how things work. We all have our different experiences, and then we have these frameworks for prioritizing certain kinds of knowledge over others. And so I think kind of a humility in understanding that that there's so much that we're missing when we have a very academic lens when we think about these problems. So absolutely, and that's where there's so much opportunity, right, for different ways of engaging different communities to connect with different approaches that could be very different. Like our universities could look and act and just be actually quite different than how we see them right now. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, again, because Jenny can't do everything in one thought, but the broad agenda is that decolonization has to be an essential part of this. Not just decolonizing the curriculum, these kind of mainstream, not even mainstream, mainstream economic theories that sadly most of our students are exposed to, but also the practices of a very Western, affluent, privileged knowledge industry that most Western universities are. In that even our daily, operations as academics, flying around the world, for example, or this university's commitment to internationalization, the massive carbon impact of that and the cost of that. And that's why, there's one thing that at least the pandemic has taught us is that we can, as we're experiencing today, we have a hybrid online, reducing people's need to travel, but also it enables scholars from the global south and activists from the global south to participate in these debates as opposed to be able to pay astronomical amounts of money. But the last thing I'd say, and it's something that we've discussed at a couple of these seminars in the past, Jenny touched upon it, is the emotional, psychological dimension of all of this. We can't underestimate the emotional impact, particularly on our students, of learning about this, about what their lives are going to be like in the future. But even more than that, where is the mythic, the storytelling in this debate as well, the narrative? That's why Jenny's quite right that too often within the academy and certainly in politics and policy, it's a STEM agenda. science, technology, engineering, and, okay, the last is not management, is it? Mechanics, maths. Well, you can include management because then they sold out, they no longer do economics, just the administration of management. Is that top-down expert view? Where is the emotional, where's the poets as well as the physicists in this? And I don't mean that as a throwaway cool line of a woke professor on a Friday afternoon, although I'm that too, folks. But it really is, we are going to need every knowledge base, but particularly that storytelling. That's part of the problem, as I see, with the planetary crisis. It lacks a story, or if it does have a story, it's a science technocratic elitist one. And so where we have, where's the songs, the poetry, the plays, and so on. That's why I love Don't Look Up. Watch it if you haven't watched it, because we do need those more imaginative ways of communicating this to our our communities in particular. But apologies for abusing my position, as I always do. So we do have some questions online, Teresa.
There's quite a few here, so
Okay.
many of you through. But the first one is from Peter, who is a PhD student at Imperial College London. So he says he represents Imperial Climate Action, a group engaging with management at Imperial College about these issues. So he's two questions. Firstly, would you advocate disruption to push for more rapid change? And secondly, would you be happy for us to contact you about our strategy so far and how they can go next?
Sure. So obviously, I think it's very clear that different kinds of disruption are absolutely necessary, because without it, we'll just have more of the same. So I mean, there are lots of different ways to disrupt, and everyone has to make choices about what's a good way to make a point. So yeah, I mean, disruption is actually what we need. We need more disruption. Like there are disruptions, rather than responding to the disruptions of the crisis, which we also have to do. We also need more other proactive disruptions to encourage thinking differently. So yes, and I'd be happy to follow up with.
I can put his email in.
As would I. Resistance is fertile, not futile.
There's a few more if you don't mind to keep going. So Pauline has said, I do think we need to really seriously develop an actual strategy for this, develop a concrete plan of action together, creating a network of academics that can then be adopted locally. Or do you have any other ideas? There has been conversation about this, and they're talking about new unions and things like that. So there's quite a lot of chat going on here. But yeah, so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so there are so many possible new networks and established networks, right? So, and there's so many different scales and levels. I think this idea of local action with global solidarity is really important, because we don't want everything to be so local that places that don't have students, activists, yeah, and so there's a lot of different networks. So it's establish new ones, yes, and get connected with the existing ones. And there's this climate social science network for people who are researching the kind of climate obstructionism, which is a lot of people who, and that's a global network it has a research lens, but it has a lot of connections with active action research to knowledge to action gap, as they sometimes say.
And just to add to that, I don't know whether the person asking the question is based on the island of Ireland, but we are now at a fairly advanced developing a network of activist academics across the island. We're working in conjunction with an organization called Faculty for Future, one of the organizations that was in Jenny's presentation. And although we haven't decided yet, we're probably going to have a launch event in Galway, the University of Galway, probably in October, and then a follow-up event in hybrid form, perhaps with colleagues in the UK in November. So if anyone listening online or here is interested in this network of activist academics, please do let me know, because we can do with all the help we can get.
So next question is from Aaron, who is a PhD student at Cardiff University. And he says, should universities be sites where students are taught through practice how to be activists? And then the follow-up to that is, how do we respond to those saying this agenda is speaking to indoctrinated students?
Yeah, so first of all, I think empowering people is a fundamental part of education. So, and I don't see a divide, particularly given the corporatization of politics. I don't think, teaching students how to be activists is, a political act. It's just how to engage in the world that we're in today. So, I think engagement, empowerment is, fundamental to what we do in education. With regard to the resistance or the opposition, I'm, as some of you may have heard about what's going on in the United States with, the governor of Florida has literally outlawed teaching anything about race or DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. All those programs are defunded. So their colleagues, faculty who teach courses, who now they can't teach their courses, like that's what they do. And so and that has been leveraged as a popular, political move that has become very divisive and feeding this increased division. So my sense is to stay focused on the principles and the foundational work, and not to not engage with that divisiveness, but it almost like you don't want to feed the dragon or feed the, like there are some fundamental ideas about what educational institutions do that I think we have a responsibility to continue to talk about and engage directly with. And so I don't think we can shy away from things. So that's one response. I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I mean, the reality is students are already being indoctrinated. I mean, you go onto any economics curriculum. Where's feminist economics? Where's Marxist economics? Where's, non-Western forms of economics? So I do think that as a response to people who will say that here's the woke, tofu-eating elite liberati going to indoctrinate students, is A, to be upfront about your own values. That is where I'm coming from. That's where it is. I've never seen one of my economics colleagues ever declare that they're a capitalist. That's exactly what they're teaching. And the other thing then is the lack of variety and pluralism for our students. At least in my discipline of politics, we do expose students to different ideologies and so on. So why don't we see that in other disciplines, that there are many different ways of understanding this? And I think that would then overcome this charge that we're being propagandists, in that we're giving students a variety of approaches and then enabling them to have the skills and the space to make their own minds up. The problem at the minute is many of our disciplines are being taught without this variety, and indeed about the normative ideological power dynamics are actually hidden rather than being revealed. Now, I'm sure there are other questions online, but I'm going to give a chance for folk in the room who haven't asked a question yet. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, yes.
I'm Emma, and I'm like an independent researcher because I keep on talking about optimization and I keep on getting like very hard reactions. Like I just got rejected from the RFPB advisory committee because I brought up the land question and like politics of the land, and they said that people just couldn't accept me for that, and I've continually run into that even with this university and when I worked at the research grants department. Queens and like every single other university, like universities are a colonial project. They've never been anything else. We've talked about like modern AI over there. That's currently being researched here. There's some academic here that does research into like, what do you call it, like cyber security, but it's really tracking for like military purposes. And he owns a company based on the research that he's doing. So it's major contracts for the GCPHQ, so like Secret Service and stuff. That's what really brings in the money to this university. And in the grants department, so shocking, there's no question. There's no like internal process or that I can see of sort of like the alumni coming together and the faculty coming together. Is this within our value base? And it was the exact same University of Glasgow, where I studied. But I don't know how do we legally, because I've been thinking a lot about like IP and how in like academics sort of, I don't know, create law challenges based on like intellectual property rights. I feel like that's a very unexplored dimension of value, because like that's the military is the biggest polluter and the biggest carbon emitter in the world. I don't know if like any of the like, because Boston MIT is probably popped up by the Pentagon and stuff. I don't know if there's been any sort of, have you seen anything like that?
Before you answer, I just want to make sure, the people online here, just because the microphone is quite far away, I might have to just repeat the question. Yeah, but I'll just repeat it then for people. It's essentially a lot of universities, including this one and perhaps Boston, MIT, have funding arrangements with the military, with basically life-destroying forms of technological innovation in particular. How can this align with the value basis of the academy, which might be described as, we're supposed to be here to do good. Our job is for the common purpose of humanity, but how can you square that then with, funding for military in particular, or, forms of surveillance through technology that may actually go against our own values, particularly human rights values. So that's good.
So I'm not familiar with very much legal challenges, because I think universities are very strategic legally, and they keep things within legal frameworks, as my experience anyway. So I don't know, I don't think I can point to specific legal challenges. There are, increasingly legal challenges to fossil fuel companies and how they're manipulating knowledge, and some of that involves their engagement with universities. But I'm not familiar with that much in the legal space in this domain. But I will say that there are increasingly, efforts in different universities to restrict what a university accepts money to do, so that it is more aligned with their values. I know I was recently learned about Brown University, which is in Rhode Island in Northeast United States. They have a new policy on they will not accept or do business with or take any money from any organization that promotes misinformation. Which again is a little, and it's quite vague, their language. And so I think legally, they still have quite a lot of flexibility to. I'm aware of more of that kind of initiative to try to restrict. And obviously there's the whole fossil fuel free movement in universities around the world, where students are asking the universities to stop taking money from fossil fuel companies. But that is limited success so far, really, because the money is hard for the there's a lot of facts are like
it's another D to add the demilitarization of the university, along with decarbonisation and decolonization. And for those of you who don't know, the British Army recruits here on campus as well, which has been an issue that has been raised in the past. So this is a very important issue. Just as an aside, I can't help but think of the contradiction that here we are 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and ministers who take their positions in the executive have to pledge an oath of office to swear by only exclusively non-violent means. That is also compatible with funding for Thales, which is a local weapons manufacturer here in Belfast, or Raytheon in Derry, that actually John Hume, people have a lot of, time for, and I do. People forget that John Hume brought Raytheon, which develops the weapons guidance systems for militaries around the world. So in some ways, how can we, so it's not just the university I'm trying to get at, how can we in Northern Ireland, with this pledge of office, how is that compatible with our government supporting weapons development? And of course, there's a debate there, brings in jobs and so on, but it's a very important issue that you raised. I'm going to go back online to see if there's any other questions.
So, this one is from Julia, who is a teaching fellow also at Imperial College in London. And she says, how would you suggest responding to those who think that what they're already doing is the most worthwhile thing they can do? So her field is global health, and it's rife with colonizer domination. And in any case, the climate crisis is the biggest problem for global health. So one of the examples she gives is people are conducting a 3-year anti-malarial trial in a land where there will be 45-degree heat waves soon. So is that the best use of resources?
Yeah, very good question. So, I mean, the scale of the challenges are so big and broad that it's, I think we're all in our own ways, figuring out how can we have an impact, how can we engage, where are we empowered? So I think it's, none of us want to be judging other people and saying, oh, well, what I do is more important.
I do it all the time.
But you know what I mean? Like people are coming from where they're coming from and wanting to contribute. And so I think, so that's one side. The other side is, huge explosion in greenwashing, right? Where people, including many of our universities, saying, oh, well, we do all this and this and this for sustainability and climate. And that's one of the reasons that I take time to really distinguish between mainstream climate action and climate justice, because they're very different. And one of the challenges, and this is in my own university, we had a faculty governance process where we got all the faculty to vote for a climate justice resolution. Yeah. And in response to that, the university, instead of doing a climate action plan, they said the plan now is to do a climate justice action plan, which is good. It's a good step. And it also brought up for many of us, like, what if they do the same thing that they were going to do, right? But then just call it something different, right? So, and this is happening across, kind of this co-option. I mean, energy transition, sustainability transition is a buzzword. Like people are saying net zero is transformative, when it is, like there's so much mainstreaming of a lot of the language and some of the ideas, which is a step in toward a direction of some change, but there's also the risk of and this happens co-option kind of some of the ideas without actually changing what you're doing. So I think that's one way to think about that. It's a spectrum of things that people can do and people are trying, and you don't want to be discouraging of people. So I guess I would answer that one in that way. Yeah.
But there's also an issue, I think, of privilege and power. I mean, the project that you described in your question, in other words, what is the point in trying to research in terms of making people more resilient or populations to malaria, when at 45 degrees, human beings can't live in those areas? And so whether or not the project can pivot then in a different direction, this is I think the scale of the challenge we have in terms of research funding, is that the planet, its climate and ecosystem are changing much more rapidly than the science and the social science can catch up. And often we're literally playing catch up. But that would seem, it's probably hundreds of thousands of pounds, a lot of people involved in that, to produce a report which is going to be redundant, if that is the projections going forward. And it's not just in public health, although I do have to say, I do get hopeful in the way that public health and the health metaphor can actually be this integrating focus for what we're talking about. What's a healthy economy, a healthy society, a health promoting university? I think there's a lot in that. But I do think the last thing I would say is that I would not encourage junior colleagues and scholars to be entering into this more disruptive space, because it's a very vulnerable position that many of our colleagues are in, particularly if you're precariously employed on fixed term contracts. It is professors like myself and Jenny, we should be the ones leading on this issue, where others come in behind us. Anyway, any other questions, Teresa?
So there's just a comment to follow up on that from Fernando, who says, I guess the problem is not only people judging themselves as doing enough, but that often this is also coupled with gatekeeping against more radical forms of action. And then in brackets, often carried out by people with much less power and higher vulnerability in academia, which is what you just said. So it's just kind of.
Great minds think alike, Fernando.
Yeah, and I'd actually like to take this opportunity to also mention something I didn't mention in my talk. I'm actually quite involved in a group of academics who are calling out against doing research on solar geoengineering, which is a ultimate techno fix. It's becoming increasingly mainstreamed and getting more research funding. And the idea is that the climate is heating up global average temperatures. So what can we do to reflect the incoming solar radiation so that we can cool the planet? And the idea is that, because our policies have been ineffective, we might need this. So let's study it. The challenge, well, a couple challenges, but one is that the scientists who are developing it have, once it's out there, and it's technically it's not that hard to do. They have no control over the governance of it, who would do it, and it could be easily done, by one actor, and then have influence and control over the rest of the world. So it's actually for me, it's a power question. And the challenge that keeps coming up, though, is that because of how we've been teaching and thinking about technology for so long, that so many people think that somehow a technological idea like this, it makes more sense than restructuring our society, right?
Mm.
Which, you could easily make the case that we should be able to have more self-agency of managing and engineering how our human systems work rather than the Earth systems, right? But that is the place we are right now, that so many people are seeing, we haven't been effective in changing our social and economic systems. So therefore, we might need these technical things, and it's there's a technological optimism there that I think is dangerous, and a lack of imagination in terms of social, political, and economic change.
That's why that movie Geostorm, it's a warning. It's not a manual about how we deal with the climate crisis if you go and watch it. But it's also only a hop, step, and a jump away from solar radiation management and these geoengineering planetary scale technologies to the batshit ideas of Elon Musk that are getting serious attention of colonizing Mars. It's all about avoiding. But maybe we should, change the structure of our society rather than thinking of, colonizing Mars. Anyway, if anyone that hasn't spoken in the room would like to make a comment or ask a question, I'll just go, oh yes, sorry, please.
In relation to people in general in society, what I find in my research as a documentary artist is that eco anxiety is massively on the increase. And then if you're talking about changing society, maybe it's more about educating people in what's happening in their own doorstep, because I think the whole global aspect is setting people in the delirium, and it's, it's too much, but if they break it down to what's going to happen either locally or in the country, then people have a better understanding, and then we'll share with them how they can tackle their own carbon footprint as well within their own environment.
Okay.
And then that flows into other countries.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that comment. And I think one thing that I try to do, and I may not have done it very well in this talk, is that actually prioritizing climate justice will make a better future for everyone, right? It's actually the most bringing hope to this time of anxiety, right? And so that's also, we're moving away from the decarbonization and all about greenhouse gas accounting and stuff is just not inspiring, because no matter how much we reduce, it's not enough. And so it's a kind of futile. I'm not saying it's futile. It's very important. We need to do it, but it's not. It doesn't get at the root issues that people are sensing and feeling and experiencing, right? And it never will. And that's another problem with the technological narrow focus. So the idea that leveraging the climate crisis for bigger societal change that will make everybody's lives and futures more fulfilling, healthy, that's what we actually need to be better at communicating and offering as it's not about sacrifice and, to save the planet, that's the not wrong message. But that's what that's what's getting picked up by a lot of people, like, oh, I'm supposed to not do this and not do that for some problem that's not gonna be solved anyway, right? That's what people feel, and it is a dead end, right? It doesn't offer much, but I think the opportunity is to flip it around and say, this is a time where we can all collectively engage and work toward a better future for everyone. And it's not about sacrifice, it's not giving up things, it's actually reprioritizing what's really important to people and for our well-being and for our relationships and our health. And it could be, it should be better. So it's not it's a way to engage in a hopeful way that can alleviate, and also action. We know being empowered and taking action helps us deal with our anxieties about everything, right? So if we can leverage that anxiety for positive change, I think it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, it's hard people giving them ownership.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the centrality of agency and activism.
Yeah.
You can't be hopeful and be passive.
No.
And actually, that's the attraction of technological optimism. It doesn't require us to do anything.
Yeah.
Elon's
Keep
got
everything
it.
the same.
Yeah, the techno fix people were going to solve it. I'm going to give just because I want a variety of voices and those who haven't spoken yet. Is there any more online? Yes, sir.
It was actually broadly covered by the lady's point there. I was very grateful for that. I guess where I was coming from with it is whenever you brought up like Kate Raworth and economics and kind of degrowth movement writ large, it's primarily about downscaling consumption in the global north, because that's kind of the biggest driver of climate change, ecological collapse. How do you sell that to people in the university setting? Because like you said, these technological fixes are excellent because people can continue to live as they did before without technically having to sacrifice as much. And I know that's one of kind of the issues that was put against degrowth, is that even the word itself implies loss. Even if that's not true, in this university context, how do you reorient that narrative?
Yeah, so I think leveraging our emotional state is really important one. The anxiety, the loneliness, the like individualistic unhappiness that is, widespread and growing, it seems like, and pointing to collective action and community and the relationality, I think it's becoming more and more clear to people that just because you have more money, you're not happier, right? Or you have more stuff, you're not happier. So like there's space there. There's a lot of space. People who are struggling and don't have enough, obviously needs that again, it's so exclusive when we talk about consumption and exclude, it doesn't resonate, right, with many people. So that's where the kind of collective action and social justice focus really, and climate justice focus can just resonate and move it away from that, the sacrifice or like giving up stuff, right? Like that is just not helpful.
And like a full swing, that sense of community. Do you feel like the disasters, the growing frequency disaster, like natural disasters that we're seeing, like say the smoke coming over New York, coming from Canada, just kind of like that trans community effects that people are experiencing in these disasters, could that serve as like a unifying force?
Yeah, I mean, there's potential there, but the other opportunity that emerges, and this is what we see in all kinds of disruptions and disasters, is that people kind of reinforce themselves for just themselves and their family. Like, I'll protect if you have enough resources, you can, I don't know, get gas masks or go fly to a different clean air place, right? So there's all kinds of potential for these disruptive events to actually exacerbate. Another thing is that, after big hurricanes and things, people have house insurance, home insurance, are able to rebuild their house even nicer because they get money to rebuild and people who didn't are
Yeah.
worse off, right? So each disasters do exacerbate economic inequities very often. But I think what you're pointing to is the possibility for, this cumulative day after day, one thing after another, like people are recognizing that the direction requires something different, and it could be an opportunity for solidarity, absolutely.
But what this does point to is the conservative nature of resilience. Resilience means bouncing back to the status quo ante. It means going back to where you were. Why on earth do we want to make ourselves resilient to an abusive, ecocidal, inequality-producing system? What we need is transformation. We need to bounce forward, not bounce back. But unfortunately, most of our thinking around responding to the climate crisis is to maintain the status quo. Look what happened, as Colin would know. What did our engineers in the Department of Infrastructure do to build flood defences, which we need? Rather than going for nature-based solutions, or indeed going to the communities who live on the lagoon, they chopped down sometimes 100, 150-year-old trees, which are not just of ecological significance. One of them was planted by or in commemoration of a suffragette. So that's, part of the problem there in terms of this technocratic, scientific, but a very narrow view of resilience. So it's about protecting the status quo. But you're absolutely correct, I would say, and I speak as a post-growth activist and economist, and I use post-growth, not degrowth, because it suffers from a language issue. Because Jenny pointed out, it's perfectly compatible with a post-growth view that some people need to consume more. So it's not as if everybody has to consume less. That's completely a misunderstanding. It's about a redistribution of the available wealth, assets, and resources in society so that nobody has to go to bed hungry. But we don't have this excessive wealth. I mean, we now have the empirical evidence. We literally cannot afford the super rich. They are responsible for most of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So in other words, we have to really start facing up to that issue we probably haven't dealt with, certainly in Western Europe and North America, at least since the 1970s, of redistribution. And that's why I'm a socialist, for purely functional reasons. There's absolutely no way that we can continue with a resilience orientation to green our current societies in which people are still going to be worse off. So and that's the positivity Jenny is talking about.
And a very practical proposal is that there should be like a minimum income and a maximum income, right? Like keep everybody within that, and then that would change a lot of dynamics, right? Because the billionaires really are not helping.
No, it's even more than that.
They're really hurting,
We
right?
need to own and control the means of production as well. Income and wealth redistribution is only part of the problem. Why can't we, particularly on the energy system? It is now much more technically possible for workers, for communities, and so on to own and control the very economic or energy means of production. And that leads me nicely into perhaps the last comment, unless other people in the room have any more questions about something that's excited quite a few of us here in the university and activists. It's community wealth building. And for those of you who don't know what community wealth building is, it's a kind of a municipal alternative economic development model where anchor institutions, in America, we've got this lovely phrase, the EDs and MEDs. What they mean by that is the education institutions like universities, further education colleges, the school system, and MEDs then are medical institutions. So for example, in Belfast, for those of you who live here, you probably didn't know that our Belfast Social and Healthcare Trust is the biggest trust in the UK. It employs thousands and thousands of people. It has a massive procurement budget for buying energy, materials, and so on. Add into that Belfast City Council. We have 3 universities in our city. We have the Harbour Estate. We have TransLink, which is a publicly owned transportation company. So then you begin to see these public sector institutions with large procurement budgets. Why aren't they using that to do the things that Jenny was talking about? Buy green energy, support local worker cooperatives. In other words, to democratize or at least make our local economy less extractivist and so on. So just wondering whether in the book that you're currently writing, whether part of it you're exploring the role of the university in this new kind of local municipal community wealth building initiative.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I'm looking for examples, so we can talk more about what your insights on this. But that's exactly what that whole section on finance and economics and kind of this reparative lens, and community ownership and community wealth building is definitely central. And there's so much universities could do to facilitate, right? And engage with that. So yeah, great way to end on a positive note.
Absolutely. So can I ask both of you, oh, sorry, there's one more question.
Following on what you're talking about a minute ago, it's just, I heard a great, it's for Pauline, who I read out earlier, she said, I heard a great point this week, degrowth as a term is good exactly because it is so unattractive and bad, it will never be co-opted, so something to consider.
Aye, absolutely. So thank you all online and here in person. So can I ask you to put your hands together to thank Jenny. I encourage you all to go out and enjoy this glorious sunshine while we have it.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Some people on but compact.
And you can Google me. I have it.
You can, yeah, there seems to be a lot of time.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
So it's me working with an organization called Faculty for a Future. So Faculty for a Future, they have a website